The moment Cora Shepard stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan's Crossing, Texas, in the summer of 1878, she had nothing but the dress on her back, the dust on her boots, and a worn leather Bible pressed so tightly against her chest that the cover had left a faint impression on the fabric of her bodice. The town was small, the way most cattle towns in West Texas were small, built more from necessity than ambition. There was a general store with a crooked sign, a livery stable that smelled powerfully of horse and hay, a saloon from which piano music drifted even at this hour of the afternoon, and a church whose white paint had blistered and peeled in the relentless heat. The main street was nothing more than a wide ribbon of red dust, and the few men who stood along the plank sidewalk watched the arriving stage with the casual curiosity of people who did not have enough entertainment to be choosy about it. Cora noticed all of it in a single sweeping glance. She had learned long ago to assess a place quickly. You had to, when you were a woman traveling alone in 1878 with no family left to speak of and nothing in your pocket but a folded letter that had mostly crumbled at the creases from how many times she had read it. She stepped down from the stage, and the driver handed her a small carpetbag, which held nothing of real substance. A spare petticoat, a comb missing 2 teeth, a tin of salve she used for the chapping that came from riding in the dry air. She took the bag without a word of thanks, because gratitude required breath and she was saving hers. The letter in her pocket was from a man she had never met, a rancher by the name of Doyle Fitch, who had advertised in a St. Louis newspaper for a woman of good character to come west and serve as a housekeeper for his household and his 2 motherless sons. The pay was modest. The work would be hard. But Cora had been sleeping in a boarding house in St. Louis for 6 months since her mother died, paying for it by mending clothes, and when the money ran out, the landlady had been perfectly clear about what would happen next. She had read Doyle Fitch's advertisement 4 times before folding it into her pocket. Good character. Those 2 words had caught her, because they were the only kind of character she had. She had written him a letter the same evening. His reply had arrived 3 weeks later, telling her to be on the stage to Harlan's Crossing on the 15th of July. It was the 15th of July. Cora stood in the dust and looked at the town and squared her shoulders in the way her mother had always told her to do when she was frightened. Stand tall, her mother had said. Let the fear go into your feet and into the ground where it belongs. She walked toward the general store, because it seemed the most logical place to ask directions to the Fitch Ranch, and because she needed a moment out of the direct sun. She pushed open the door and the small bell above it announced her arrival. Inside it smelled of tobacco and dried beans and kerosene, and a heavy woman behind the counter looked up from her ledger. "Afternoon," the woman said. "You come in on the stage?" "Yes, ma'am." "I am looking for the Fitch Ranch. I have business with Mr. Doyle Fitch." The woman's expression shifted in a way that was difficult to read, something between sympathy and hesitation. "Well now," she said slowly, setting down her pen, "you would be the girl from St. Louis." "Cora Shepard," Cora said, because she liked for people to use her name. "I am Martha Greer," the woman said. "This is my husband's store." She paused for a long moment. "Miss Shepard, I am afraid I have some difficult news for you, and I am sorry you are hearing it from a stranger." The Bible in Cora's hand grew heavier. "Mr. Fitch died 12 days ago," Martha Greer said. "A fever. Came on fast and took him before doctor. Hensley could do much of anything. I am sorry, truly." The world did not spin exactly, but it tilted in a manner that made Cora reach for the counter. 12 days. He had been dead 12 days, and the letter telling her to come had already been in transit before anyone could stop it. She had ridden 3 days on a stagecoach to a position that no longer existed, to a man who was no longer alive. "The boys," she said, because her mind went immediately and instinctively to the 2 motherless children the advertisement had mentioned. "What has happened to his sons?" Martha Greer folded her hands on the counter. "They have gone to their grandmother up in Abilene. She came for them right away." "Good woman, Mrs. Fitch Sr., they will be cared for." Cora nodded slowly, releasing the breath she had been holding. At least there was that. "Do you have a place to stay?" Martha asked, and her voice was genuinely kind. "Not yet," Cora admitted. "We have a spare room above the store. It is small and it costs 50 cents a week. You are welcome to it while you sort yourself out." Cora thought of the money she had. Enough for perhaps 3 weeks if she was careful. 3 weeks to find work in a town she had never been to, where nobody knew her, in a territory that was not particularly gentle to women on their own. "I will take it," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Greer." She climbed the narrow stairs that evening with her carpetbag and her Bible in her silence, and she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and opened the Bible to the page that was most worn, the page that bore her mother's handwriting in the margins, small and cramped and full of conviction. She read what her mother had written there for the 100th time, and then she closed the book and pressed it between her palms and prayed the only prayer she knew how to pray in hard circumstances, which was simply, "I do not know what comes next. Please be the one who does." The morning came, as mornings do, indifferent to the previous night's difficulties. Cora washed her face in the basin, smoothed her hair back with her comb, and went downstairs to find out what Harlan's Crossing needed. Martha Greer, it turned out, knew everything that happened in that town and had opinions about all of it. Over a breakfast of biscuits and sorghum, she informed Cora that the church needed cleaning badly and Reverend Aldridge would be grateful for the help, that the schoolteacher had left in May and hadn't been replaced, that the saloon was hiring, but Martha fixed her with a look that made it clear she expected better of Cora without saying so outright, and that the biggest ranching operation in 20 miles was the Alden spread, situated about 4 miles east of town. "Patrick Alden runs it now," Martha said, pouring coffee thick as mud into Cora's cup. "His father built it up, passed on 3 winters ago. Patrick is 28, runs about 400 head, employs 6 hands. Decent man. Quiet, doesn't come to town more than he has to." "Is he looking for any kind of help?" Cora asked, because practicality was the thing she had left when everything else had been taken. Martha tilted her head. "He might be. He has been without a cook since his last one, Mrs. Bautista, went to live with her daughter in San Antonio. That was 2 months past. The men have been taking turns making their own meals, which from what I hear is a genuine hardship. None of them have any talent for it." Cora had been cooking since she was 8 years old. Her mother had been sick for many of those years, and Cora had learned to stretch a little into a lot and make it taste like something worth eating. "I will ride out and ask him," she said. Martha raised an eyebrow. "Can you ride?" "I can manage," Cora said, which was a careful and technically accurate answer. Martha arranged a horse from the livery and gave Cora directions, and by 9 in the morning Cora was riding east on a roan mare that was patient with her inexperience, along a trail that wound through dry grass and scrub brush and the occasional twisted mesquite tree. The sky was enormous and very blue, and the heat was already building, the way it did in Texas in July, arriving early and staying until long after sundown. She found the Alden ranch without any wrong turns because the trail was clear and the gate, a simple wooden affair with the letter A burned into the crossbeam, was impossible to miss. She rode through it and up a gentle rise toward a long, low house of cedar planks and a large barn behind it, and several outbuildings she couldn't immediately identify. A bunkhouse, a chicken coop, a smokehouse. She had nearly reached the house when a man emerged from the barn. He was tall in the manner of men who did not think about their height, carrying it as naturally as he carried the coil of rope over one shoulder. He wore a faded blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and his hat was pulled low against the sun. His face, when he pushed the hat back slightly to look at the approaching rider, was weathered in the way that outdoor work weathered a person, not aged exactly, but shaped like wood that had been left in the elements long enough to become something with character. He had dark eyes and a firm jaw, and he was looking at her with the open, uncalculating attention of a man who had not expected a visitor and was simply taking in what he saw. He waited until she pulled up near the fence post before he spoke. "Morning," he said. "You lost?" "No," Cora said. "I am looking for Patrick Alden." "You found him." She did not dismount immediately because she wanted to present herself properly, on level terms rather than looking up at him from the ground. "My name is Cora Shepard. I arrived in Harlan's Crossing yesterday. I was meant to take a position at the Fitch Ranch, but Mr. Fitch has passed, and Mrs. Greer at the general store mentioned that you might be in need of a cook." Patrick Alden was quiet for a moment. He set the coil of rope down over the fence post and tucked his thumbs in his belt and studied her with those dark eyes, not unkindly but thoroughly. "Where are you from?" he asked. "St. Louis, Missouri." "You come out here alone?" "Yes." He glanced at her hands, at the worn Bible she was holding against the saddle horn because she hadn't thought to leave it at Mrs. Greer's and now felt slightly self-conscious about it. "You cook well." "Well enough that I have been doing it my whole life and nobody has complained yet," she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one. "That is a careful kind of answer." "I am a careful kind of person." He was quiet again for a moment, looking out across the yard, then back at her. "Come down," he said. "I'll show you the kitchen and you can tell me what you think." She dismounted with considerably less grace than she would have liked, the mare shifting at the last moment so that she had to grab the saddle horn to keep her balance. And when she straightened, she found Patrick Alden watching with an expression that was carefully neutral, which she appreciated. He tied the horse to the fence and led her to the house. Inside it was cool, the thick cedar walls holding the night's temperature against the day's heat. The main room held a stone fireplace, a table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair near the window, and the kind of comfortable disorder that accumulated when people were busy and not particularly concerned with appearances. Rope boots, a stack of newspapers, a worn jacket on a peg. The kitchen was at the back of the house and was, she realized with a surge of relief, genuinely well equipped. A good cast-iron stove, a proper dry sink with a pump handle, shelves of supplies that were well stocked, at least in the dry goods, a large work table. "It is a good kitchen," she said honestly. "Mrs. Bautista kept it well," he said. "I have maintained the supplies as best I could." He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she would later come to recognize as the thing he did when he was about to say something he was slightly uncertain about. "I can offer you $3 a week, a room in the house, and your meals. The work is cooking for myself and 6 hands, 3 meals a day except Sunday supper, which the men generally fend for themselves. The hands are decent men. No trouble." $3 a week was more than she had been making in St. Louis. "I will need to bring my bag from Mrs. Greer's store," Cora said. "And I would like it understood from the beginning that I am an employee, not a household ornament. I will cook and I will keep the kitchen and I will do what is reasonable, but I will not be talked to with disrespect by anyone." He looked at her steadily. "Nobody on my ranch talks to anyone with disrespect," he said. "That is already understood." She held out her hand. He shook it without hesitation, his grip firm and brief. "When can you start?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "I will have breakfast on the table by 6:30 if you tell me what time the hands rise." 5:30, he said. "So 6 would be better." 6 it is. She rode back to town, returned the mare, thanked Martha Greer, paid for one night in the room, and the following morning she arrived at the Alden Ranch with her carpetbag in one hand and her worn Bible under her arm, and a set expression that meant she was ready to work. Patrick was already up. He met her at the door with a cup of coffee, which surprised her, and pointed her to the room she would use, which was small and clean and had a window that faced east. So the morning light came in with a kind of enthusiasm that she found, after a moment's consideration, she liked. She set the Bible on the windowsill where the morning light would touch it and unpacked her few things and tied on the apron she found hanging behind the kitchen door. And by 6 o'clock, the kitchen was producing biscuits and salt pork and gravy, and the smell of it brought the hands in from the bunkhouse with expressions of such profound relief that she had to suppress a smile. There were 6 of them. Tom Bray, the eldest, gray-haired and laconic. Hector Vasquez, who was from Sonora originally and spoke English with deliberate precision. Young Ellis Park, who was 19 and perpetually hungry. Big Charlie Dodd, who was not particularly big but had earned the name in some previous context nobody explained. Lou Fenwick, who was quiet and kept to himself. And Samuel Reed, who was the foreman, a broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with a steady manner, and a habit of thanking her for every meal, every single time, which she appreciated. Patrick Alden ate with his men at the big table, which she had not expected. Many ranch owners took their meals separately, maintaining a distance from their employees. Patrick did not. He sat at the head of the table, but he was easy with them, following their conversations, contributing when he had something to say and remaining quiet when he didn't. He was not a man who spoke simply to fill space, she noticed. Every word he said was one he had chosen. The first week passed in the way first weeks do, with the busy effort of learning a place and its rhythms. She learned which hands took their coffee black and which wanted it sweetened, that Ellis Park would eat absolutely anything she put in front of him, that Hector Vasquez had opinions about the proper use of dried chilies and was right about all of them, and that Patrick Alden came to the kitchen sometimes in the evenings after the others had gone to their bunks, not to bother her, but to check that the stove had been properly banked and the kitchen was in order. These were his habits, she understood, not a commentary on her work. On the 4th evening he came in and found her sitting at the kitchen table with her Bible open and a single candle lit, writing something in the margins with the stub of a pencil. He stopped in the doorway. "Sorry," he said. "I didn't know you were still up." "I am always up at this hour," she said. "Come and check the stove, I don't mind." He crossed the kitchen, checked the damper on the stove, and then, instead of leaving, he pulled out the chair across the table from her and sat down with the particular quality of a man who has had a long day and has nowhere better to be. "What are you writing?" he asked, not prying, just asking. "Notes," she said. "My mother wrote in the margins of her Bible her whole life. Things she was thinking about, prayers, observations. It became a kind of habit she passed to me." He looked at the Bible across the table from him. "That's her Bible," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "My mother had one she kept on the mantel, never wrote in it, treated it more like an object than a book. I always thought that was interesting, how some people read a thing and some people live in it." Cora looked at him. "Which are you?" "I'm not much for reading," he admitted without embarrassment. "I can read, I just don't do it much. The ranch takes most of the daylight, and by evening my eyes don't want to focus on small print." "What do you do in the evenings?" He tilted his head slightly. "Sit on the porch, think, check the animals, sleep when I'm tired enough." "That sounds solitary." "It is," he said simply. Then, "Does that concern you? Should it? You're the one asking." She smiled, and it was the first real smile she had given anyone since she'd arrived in Texas. Honest and warm and slightly unexpected even to herself. "No," she said. "I like quiet. I was raised in it." He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his expression that she couldn't quite name, an attention that was different from the way the hands looked at her, which was respectful and impersonal. His attention had a quality of genuine interest to it, as though he was curious about the specific person she was rather than the general category of her. She looked back at her Bible and found her page again, and he sat for a little while in comfortable silence before saying good night and going to bed, and that was the beginning of it, though neither of them would have been able to say so at the time. The summer deepened, hot and dry and relentless, and the work of the ranch expanded to fill every hour. July rolled into August and August into September, and the days became slightly shorter, and the nights slightly cooler, and the sky in the evenings turned colors that made Cora stop whatever she was doing and look out the kitchen window. She had grown up in Missouri, which had its beauty, but it was a different kind of beauty, green and complicated and close. Texas was open, almost aggressively so, and the sky here felt like a demonstration of something. She had fallen into the life of the Alden Ranch, the way a river falls into a canyon, following the shape of the place and becoming part of it. She knew where everything was and how to manage with what was on hand when supplies ran low. She had begun keeping a kitchen garden in the strip of ground near the back door, coaxing beans and squash from the dry soil with careful watering from the well, and Patrick had seen her at it one morning and come out without being asked and dug the rows straighter than she had managed on her own. "You don't have to do that," she had said. "I know," he had said, and kept digging. They talked in the evenings more and more. She learned his history in the careful, unhurried way that people reveal things when they are not being interrogated, but simply heard. His father, William Alden, had come to Texas from Georgia after the war, a man who had survived something he never quite named, and had built the ranch from nothing with the particular ferocity of a man who needs to prove something to himself. Patrick had been born on the ranch in 1850, raised between the demands of the land and the expectations of a father who was not unkind but who was not easy. He had a sister in Austin, Eleanor, married to a lawyer. He went to see her twice a year. "Do you miss having family nearby?" Cora asked one evening. They were on the porch now, which had become a thing they did, sit on the porch after supper when the day had cooled and the cicadas were saying whatever it was cicadas said. "I miss having my mother nearby," he said. "She died 6 years ago. My father went hard after that. The ranch was all there was for both of us until he went too." "I lost my mother in January," Cora said. He turned to look at her. "I'm sorry. She was sick for a long time. I had time to prepare." She paused. "You're never prepared." "No," he said. "You're not." She could feel the weight of shared understanding between them, the particular comfort of being with someone who knows the thing you know. "What was she like?" he asked. And Cora told him, and it was the first time she had talked about her mother to anyone since the funeral, and she had not known until the words started coming that she had been keeping them dammed up inside her like water behind a wall. She told him about her mother's garden in St. Louis, about her extraordinary patience, about the way she had read to Cora every night from the Bible, and from whatever other books they could afford, about how she had never complained about being sick even when the pain was considerable, about the handwriting in the margins of the worn Bible on Cora's windowsill, small and fierce and full of faith. Patrick listened without interrupting, without trying to offer comfort of the kind that fixes nothing and sometimes makes things worse. He just listened, and when she was done he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "She sounds like someone worth missing." Cora pressed her lips together. She was. After that the evenings on the porch became something she counted on in a way she wouldn't have admitted to anyone. She brought her mending sometimes, or simply sat with her hands in her lap watching the stars come out. He brought his coffee and occasionally a piece of wood he was working on, whittling something or other, though the results were not particularly artistic, and he didn't seem to expect them to be. The process was what he was after. One evening in late September, when the air had turned enough that she had brought a shawl, Tom Bray came out of the bunkhouse and passed them on his way to the outhouse, and gave them a look that was affectionate and slightly knowing. And Cora had the sudden clear awareness that the other men had noticed the pattern of these evenings and had drawn conclusions. She felt heat in her face that had nothing to do with the temperature. When Bray had gone, she looked sideways at Patrick. He was looking at the middle distance with an expression of deliberate neutrality. "They've noticed," she said. "Probably," he said. "Does that concern you?" He looked at her then the way he sometimes did, directly and without deflection. "Does it concern you?" "I am your employee," she said carefully. "That's a practical concern," he said. "I'm asking about the other kind." She looked out at the yard, at the shapes of the mesquite trees in the last light. She was 24 years old, and she had arrived in this town with nothing but the clothes she wore and her mother's Bible, and a position that had dissolved before she got there. And she had remade herself here, quietly and practically, and she had not let herself think about wanting things that were beyond practical necessity. But she was 24 years old and she was not made of stone, and sitting beside Patrick Alden in the evening air had become the thing she looked forward to most in each day, and that was a fact she had been trying not to look at directly. "No," she said finally. "It doesn't concern me." He turned back to the middle distance, and she could see the edge of his expression from the side, and it was quiet and warm. "Good," he said. October came with wind and the first cold nights, and the sky at dawn turned colors she had never seen in Missouri, orange and rose, and a particular shade of violet that seemed to belong entirely to the Texas sky. The work shifted with the season, the ranch hands busy with the fall cattle drive preparations, Patrick riding out early and coming back late, and the kitchen becoming the center of the house in a new way, the one warm and busy place. She had begun to recognize all the sounds the house made: the creak of the third porch step, the particular rattle of the kitchen window in a west wind, the sound of Patrick's boots on the floor, which was different from the sound of any of the hands' boots, a certain deliberate evenness in his step. She heard him come in late one evening, later than usual, and when he came through the kitchen he stopped because she had left supper on the back of the stove for him, covered with a cloth, which she had begun doing without being asked on the nights when he was out past supper time. He stood looking at it for a moment, and then he said, to the room in general but obviously to her, "You don't have to do this." "I know," she said, which was what he had said to her about digging the garden rows. She heard a sound from him that might have been a laugh, brief and quiet, and then the sound of the chair at the table being pulled out and him sitting down. She appeared in the kitchen doorway because she had been in the main room by the fire. "Was it a hard day?" she asked. "Lost a heifer in the creek crossing," he said. His voice was tired. "Couldn't get her out in time." He looked at the plate in front of him and then up at her. "Thank you for this. Eat," she said. "It's been warming since 7. She went back to the fire and he ate, and afterward he brought his plate to the dry sink himself, which none of the hands did and she had never asked him to do, and he stood in the kitchen doorway, and she was sitting by the fire with her Bible, and they looked at each other across the warmth of the main room. "Come to church Sunday," she said. It came out before she had organized it into a question, almost an invitation, almost a request. He raised an eyebrow slightly. "I haven't been to church since my mother was alive. Reverend Aldridge is not particularly frightening," she said, "and the church needs bodies in the pews. I have been going every Sunday, and it is a very small congregation." He was quiet a moment. "All right," he said. She had not expected him to agree. He came to church Sunday in a clean shirt and his better hat, and he sat beside her in the second pew, and when they sang the hymns he did not sing, but he held the hymnal open and followed the words with his eyes, which she found, for reasons she could not entirely explain, very moving. Reverend Aldridge, a small, energetic man in his 50s with a great enthusiasm for Scripture and a warm, personal manner, noticed Patrick in the pew and shook his hand afterward with genuine pleasure. "Mr. Alden, it is good to see you here." "Miss Shepard invited me," Patrick said, which was the straightforward truth, and Reverend Aldridge looked between them with the expression of a man who understood something that the people in front of him had not yet put entirely into words. They rode back to the ranch together, the morning bright and clear, the horses walking side by side on the wide trail. "That was good," Patrick said after a while. "Which part?" "All of it, I think," he said. "I hadn't realized how much I missed that." "Miss church, miss something that isn't work," he said. "Something that asks you to stop and think about something bigger than what's directly in front of you." She looked at the sky. "My mother used to say that church was just the practice of making room for God. You could do it anywhere, but it helped to do it with other people." He considered this. "She put a lot of good things in her margins," he said. She turned to look at him. "How do you know that?" "Because most of what you say has the quality of something worth writing down," he said simply. And then he looked at the road ahead as though he hadn't said anything in particular, and she rode beside him with her heart doing something she hadn't given it permission to do. That evening, she did not go to the porch. She stayed in her room for a little while, sitting on her bed with the Bible in her hands, not reading it but feeling the weight of it, the familiar worn cover, the soft familiar pages. She needed to think. She had been so careful, so deliberately careful about keeping herself within the appropriate limits of her situation. She was his employee. She had no family, no resources, no position beyond what she had made for herself here. She could not afford to mistake simple kindness for something more, and she had been making every effort not to. But she was 24 years old, and Patrick Alden had said that most of what she said had the quality of something worth writing down, and the effort of not wanting things was beginning to feel like its own kind of exhaustion. There was a knock at her door. Miss Shepard, his voice, muffled by the door. "I'm going out to the porch for a while if you want to." She sat for a moment. "I'll be out in a few minutes," she said. She went out, and they sat in the dark with the stars enormous above them and the cold, clear air and the distant sound of coyotes, and he said, "I want to tell you something." "All right," she said. He turned to look at her, and in the starlight his face was very serious and very sincere. "When you rode up that first morning," he said, "I didn't know what to make of you. A woman from St. Louis alone with a carpetbag and a Bible. I thought this won't last a week." And she said, because she could tell there was more. "And I have been wrong about exactly one thing in my life that I am grateful to have been wrong about," he said. "This is it." Her breath came slowly. "Patrick, I am not good at this," he said with a kind of quiet candor. "I have not had a lot of practice saying what I mean in this particular way, but I mean it. You have made this place something I want to come home to in a way I didn't know I was missing." She looked at him for a long time. The Bible was in her hands, as it always was, and she was aware of it, the worn cover beneath her fingers, her mother's words in the margins, the weight and the history of it. "I arrived here with nothing," she said quietly. "You arrived here with exactly enough," he said. He nodded at the Bible. "That included." She felt tears press behind her eyes, not sad ones but the kind that come when something fits so precisely, where it should, that the relief is almost unbearable. She blinked them back. "I should tell you," she said carefully, "that I am not a simple woman. I have opinions and I have standards, and I am not good at being quiet when I think something is wrong. I have been told this is a difficulty." "By who?" "Various people." "They were wrong," he said. "Those aren't difficulties, those are qualities." She looked at him for a long, steady moment, and then she said, "I like you very much, Patrick Alden. I have been working very hard not to." The suggestion of a smile she had seen on that first day became an actual one, warm and a little surprised and entirely genuine. "I know," he said. "I've been watching you work at it. You didn't make it easy." "No," he admitted. "I didn't try to." She laughed, a real laugh, and it surprised her, the sound of it in the night air, and he laughed too, and the tension of weeks of careful restraint went out of both of them like a fire finally allowed to breathe. They sat together for a long time after that, not saying much, not needing to, the kind of companionship that has stopped performing itself and is simply present. November brought the cold in earnest, and with it a change in the rhythm of the ranch that Cora had not entirely anticipated. The big fall cattle drive had been completed at the end of October, Patrick and 4 of the hands driving 200 head to Abilene where they were sold, and when they came back, Patrick had the money from the sale and a kind of settled satisfaction about him that made Cora understand why men who worked with the land and the seasons had a particular relationship to time. The year had its shape, and you lived inside that shape, and when the shape was fulfilled, there was a completeness to it. She had missed him while he was gone. The 3 days of his absence had revealed to her with perfect clarity how deeply she had come to depend on his presence, not in the way that could be called dependency precisely, but in the way that you come to depend on sunlight, because it is good and natural and part of how everything works. When he rode back in, she was at the kitchen window, and she saw him coming up the trail, and she had to actively resist going to the door, instead turning back to the stove and making a great show of attending to supper. He came into the kitchen a while later, dusty and tired and smelling of trail, and he said, "That smells good," and she said, "Sit down, I'll bring you coffee." And he sat down and she brought him coffee, and when she set it in front of him, he put his hand over hers briefly, just for a moment, just a warm pressure, and then let go. "Good to be back," he said. "Good to have you back," she said, and went back to the stove, and neither of them made anything more of it than that, but everything had been said. He asked her to go to the Christmas social in Harlan's Crossing in early December, which was an event Martha Greer organized every year at the church hall, and which the entire community attended. He asked her formally, with the slightly careful manner he had when he was uncertain whether he was getting the tone right, and she said yes, and tried not to let her pleasure be too visible, which was increasingly difficult. The day of the social she wore her one good dress, which was a dark green wool she had brought from St. Louis and rarely had occasion to put on. She stood at the small mirror in her room and pinned her hair up properly for the first time in months, and thought about her mother, who had loved Christmas with the undiluted joy of a woman for whom the simple pleasures were enough. Patrick knocked on her door to let her know the wagon was ready, and when she came out he looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention and said, "You look very nice," with the straightforward sincerity of a man who is not trying to flatter but simply stating what he sees. "Thank you," she said, and was grateful the cold gave her cheeks an excuse for their color. The social was warm and noisy, and full of the entire population of Harlan's Crossing and the surrounding ranches, which meant perhaps 80 people in a space designed for 60, but nobody seemed to mind. There was music from 2 fiddlers and a man on a button accordion, and long tables covered in food that every family had contributed to, and children running between the legs of adults, and the kind of communal warmth that is particular to small communities in winter. People who have spent months in the company of the same small circle drawing closer rather than apart. Martha Greer found Cora within 5 minutes of their arrival and embraced her with genuine affection, because Martha had developed a maternal regard for Cora over the months since July and made no secret of it. She then shook Patrick's hand and looked between them with the same knowing expression Reverend Aldridge had worn. They danced. Patrick was not particularly skilled at dancing, which he admitted freely and without embarrassment, but he was a good partner in the sense that mattered most, which was that he paid attention and tried to accommodate rather than leading with the assumption that he was always right. Cora had a better sense of the steps than he did, and she guided him subtly, and he caught on quickly, and by the 3rd song they were moving together with a natural ease that drew a few warm glances from the people around them. At some point in the evening they ended up standing by the window, slightly away from the crowd, with cups of cider, watching the room. "This is your world now," he said. "Or it could be if you want it." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" He turned to her. He had the expression he wore when he had been thinking about something for a long time and had finally decided to say it. "I mean that you came here with nothing but a letter and your bag and that Bible, and you have made something here. A place in this community, a position, a life." He paused. "I would like to ask you something." "Ask," she said, because her heart was doing the thing again. "I would like to ask if you would consider staying," he said. "Not as my cook, as my wife." The room continued around them, the fiddles playing, the children running, the warmth of 80 people in December. Cora held her cup of cider and looked at Patrick Alden, this quiet, direct, serious man who had looked at her worn Bible on their first meeting and not found it strange or lacking, and who had sat beside her in church and held the hymnal open with careful attention, and who had said that she arrived with exactly enough. "I would consider it," she said. "I have in fact been considering it." His expression opened in a way she had not seen before, a genuine uncalculated warmth. "And?" "Yes," she said simply. "Patrick, yes." He took her hand, properly and completely, and held it, and across the room Martha Greer saw this and put her hand over her mouth and grabbed her husband's arm, and Reverend Aldridge, who had been standing near the punch bowl, looked up and smiled with the satisfaction of a man who had known how this was going to resolve for quite some time. They were married in February of 1879, on a Saturday when the sky was that clear cold blue that winter produced in Texas, the light sharp and clean. The ceremony was in Reverend Aldridge's church, which was filled with the people of Harlan's Crossing. Martha Greer had organized flowers from somewhere, dried ones in winter colors, and they stood in glass jars on the windowsills and made the small church look remarkably fine. Cora carried her mother's Bible. When Reverend Aldridge reached the moment in the ceremony where he asked if there was anything that either of them wished to add, Patrick turned to her and said, quietly but in the hearing of the room, "You arrived with nothing but that Bible, and I want you to know that from the first moment I saw you with it. That was enough for me. Everything that has come after has been more than I hoped for." She felt the tears rise and let them come, because these were the right kind. She pressed her hand over the worn cover of the Bible she was holding and thought of her mother's handwriting in the margins, and understood with a completeness she had never felt before that the faith her mother had written into those margins had been right, not about the ease of things or the absence of difficulty, but about the presence of something sustaining underneath all of it. "And you have been enough for me," she said. From the beginning, Reverend Aldridge married them with evident delight. The reception was in the church hall, with food from half the community and the same 2 fiddlers from the Christmas social, and Patrick Alden danced with his wife with considerably more confidence than he had shown in December, and Cora laughed at the improvement and he laughed at being laughed at, and it was the best kind of afternoon. They went home in the wagon as the sun went down, their breath making clouds in the cold air, the stars beginning to appear. She sat beside him with her shoulder against his, and he held the reins with one hand and put his other arm around her, and she leaned into the warmth of him, and thought that there was no word for the particular quality of this kind of safety, something that was earned rather than given and therefore solid in a way that simply given things were not. She put the Bible on the mantel when they got home because it deserved the prominence her mother-in-law's had once had, and Patrick stood looking at it for a moment. "I can't read it aloud very well," he said. "My reading is slow." "Then I will read it aloud," she said, "and you can listen." "That sounds right," he said. Spring came early in 1879, the way it occasionally did in Texas, arriving in February and establishing itself with green grass and early wildflowers before anyone had quite prepared for it. Cora planted her kitchen garden in earnest, larger this time, with tomatoes and peppers alongside the beans and squash, and Patrick helped her with the rows again without being asked, and this time she didn't tell him he didn't have to. The hands had received her new position with a straightforward acceptance that touched her. Samuel Reed, the foreman, had shaken her hand on the morning after the wedding and said, "You're good for him, Mrs. Alden," with the directness of a man who only said what he meant, and Tom Bray had nodded slowly over his coffee as though something had been confirmed that he had suspected for some time. Ellis Park had grinned. Hector Vasquez had brought her a small embroidered cloth from some possession of his own, for a wedding gift, and she had thanked him in the careful way that honor deserves. She was still cooking because she wanted to, because she was good at it and it gave her satisfaction, and because the arrangement of the ranch required it. But she was also, now, learning the business of the ranch itself. Patrick showed her the books, the ledgers, the records of livestock and expenses and sales. He did not explain why he was showing her except to say, "If something happens to me, you need to know how it runs," which she found both mildly alarming and deeply respectful because he was treating her as a capable person rather than a protected one. "Nothing is going to happen to you," she said. "Probably not," he agreed. But still, she learned it. She had a good head for numbers, a thing she had discovered in her years of managing her mother's budget on very little, and the logic of the ranch finances was not difficult once she understood the pattern of it. She asked questions and he answered them with patience, and sometimes she asked questions that made him look at a thing he had always done one way and consider whether there was a better way, and these were the conversations she liked best, the ones that were genuinely mutual. In May, she wrote to his sister Alina in Austin, because Patrick's relationship with Alina had been maintained by letters since their father's death, and Patrick was not, by his own admission, a particularly good correspondent. Cora composed the letter, showed it to Patrick, adjusted it per his suggestions, and sent it with the stage. Alina's reply came back 3 weeks later and was warm and voluble and clearly delighted by the news of the marriage and the description of Cora, and she ended by announcing that she and her husband James would come for a visit in October. "Is that all right?" Cora asked, setting the letter on the table in front of him. He read it with the careful attention he gave to reading and then looked up. "She sounds relieved," he said. "Because you're not alone anymore," Cora said. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know I was." "You did know," she said gently. "You just had decided it was the way things were." He looked at her and nodded slightly, the concession of a man who is fair enough with himself to accept an accurate observation. "October is fine," he said. "She'll like you." "How do you know?" "Because she values the same things you have," he said. "She just had to find them in a lawyer instead of a ranch." Cora smiled and reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. He turned his hand over and held hers, a thing they did easily now, the familiar warmth of it. Summer came back, hot and vast, and the ranch moved into its full summer rhythm with the long days and the early mornings and the enormous sky. Cora's garden produced magnificently, the tomatoes especially, and she began putting up preserves in the way her mother had taught her, row after row of jars on the cellar shelves. The satisfaction of it something she could not adequately explain to anyone who didn't already understand it. She was putting up a batch of tomatoes one morning in July when the wave of nausea hit her without warning, and she had to sit down on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinet until it passed. When it had passed, she remained sitting for a moment, doing the calculation that the particular quality of the nausea suggested she should do. She was not, she concluded with a certainty that came all at once and settled in completely, entirely unwell. She told Patrick that evening after supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and they were alone in the kitchen. She said it simply and directly, because that was how she said things. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he got up from the table and came around to where she was sitting and crouched down beside her chair so he was at her level, and he took her hands in both of his and he said, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "Sick in the mornings," she said, "but otherwise yes." He pressed his lips together and she could see him working to contain something, not grief or worry but something large and warm that didn't have a clear outlet. He put his arms around her, right there in the kitchen, and held her properly, the kind of embrace that means something specific, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and felt the solid certainty of him. "A baby," he said quietly against her hair. "Yes," she said. He held her a moment longer and then drew back to look at her face. "We need to get Dr. Hensley out here regularly. I want you to be seen to properly." "I am not ill," she said. "I am expecting a child. They are different things." "Cora, I will see Dr. Hensley," she agreed, because she could see the sincerity of his concern and did not want to dismiss it. "But I want you to know that I am perfectly capable and I will not be treated as though I have become fragile." "I know you're not fragile," he said. "I'm going to worry anyway. That's my right." She reached up and touched his jaw, the familiar weathered texture of his face. "Yes," she said, "that is your right." Dr. Hensley came out to the ranch and confirmed what Cora had known, and pronounced her healthy and strong and likely to have a straightforward time of it. He told Patrick the same things Cora had already told him, which Patrick seemed to find more reassuring coming from a doctor, a thing Cora accepted as a personality trait rather than a commentary on her credibility. Alina and James arrived in October as planned, traveling from Austin by stage, and Alina Alden Carmichael was exactly what Cora had expected from her letters, bright and direct and warm, and inclined to say precisely what she thought without particular apology for it. She embraced her brother with the affection of a sister who has been worried about him and is relieved to find him visibly well, and she embraced Cora with the somewhat more surprised but equally genuine affection of a woman who has received exactly the sister-in-law she would have ordered if asked. "Patrick said almost nothing about you in his letters," Alina told Cora on the first evening, while the men were out looking at something on the ranch that Patrick wanted to show James. He mentioned he had a new cook. He mentioned she was from St. Louis. He did not mention that she had apparently reorganized his entire life. "I didn't reorganize it," Cora said. "I cooked and kept the kitchen." Alina gave her a look that indicated she found this modest assessment unconvincing. "He smiles now," she said. "He laughed twice before supper, my brother, who used to sit through entire evenings without producing a sound." "He has always had a good sense of humor," Cora said. "He was just keeping it for appropriate occasions." Alina laughed, a bright sound. "I think I am going to like you very much," she said. They sat by the fire in the evenings, all four of them, and talked about everything that people who are becoming family talk about: histories and opinions and plans and memories. And James Carmichael turned out to be a serious-minded man with a genuine kindness about him. And he and Patrick got along in the easy way of men who respect each other's competence in different domains. He told Patrick the legal things he needed to know about ensuring the ranch's future, the wills and deeds and such. And Patrick listened with the attention he gave to things that mattered. And Cora watched them across the fire, and felt the warmth of a life that had acquired dimensions she had not dared to anticipate when she stepped off that stage in July of 1878 with nothing in her hands but her bag and her Bible. Alina held Cora's hands one evening and looked at the rounding evidence of the coming child and said, "Do you know what you want?" "I want them to be healthy," Cora said. "What does Patrick want?" "The same thing first. After that he has expressed no preference." "He would say that." Alina smiled. "He used to say he wanted no preference about supper and then eat twice as much of whatever he actually wanted." "He does that," Cora confirmed, and they laughed together at the man who was on the other side of the room pretending not to hear them. Alina and James stayed 2 weeks and left in mid-October with the promise of returning in spring, and with a warmth between them all that was real rather than obligatory. On the morning they left, Alina held Cora for a long moment and said quietly, "Thank you for him, for what you've given him. I was afraid for him alone out here and now I'm not." Cora held her back. "He gave me just as much," she said. "More." Winter came again, and the house was full in ways it had not been the previous winter. Cora's days were shaped differently now, with the work of the growing child to account for, and Patrick was attentive without being smothering, which she appreciated. He checked on her without hovering. He adjusted the work of the house without being asked, taking on things she found physically difficult as her time drew nearer, with such naturalness that it was several days before she noticed he had been doing it. She read to him in the evenings. She had begun in December, simply reading aloud from the Bible by the fire because she missed the sound of it, and because he had said he couldn't read aloud well but liked to hear it, and they had fallen into a pattern of her reading while he sat across from her with whatever he was working on, and he listened in that attentive way he had, following the words even when he was doing something else with his hands. Sometimes she read other things. She had sent away to a bookseller in Dallas for a volume of poetry, which arrived battered from the journey but intact, and she read from it occasionally with a selectiveness about which poems she shared, choosing the ones that said something worth saying. He listened to these with a quality of attention that was different from his practical attention, quieter and more open, and afterward he sometimes said things that showed he had been genuinely thinking about what he had heard. One evening she read him a passage from the Bible, the verse about love being patient and kind, and when she finished he said, "My mother had that passage read at her funeral." She looked up. "Tell me about that day," she said. And he told her and she listened, and this was one of the things she had learned about loving Patrick Alden, that he needed to be given space to arrive at the things inside him, that they came when asked and when the space was right, and that the arriving of them was a form of trust he did not give easily or meaninglessly. The baby came in late February of 1880, during a cold snap that brought ice to the water troughs and made the house draw close around itself. Dr. Hensley was there, and Martha Greer had come out too because Cora had asked her, and because Martha was the kind of woman who knew how to be useful in exactly this situation. Patrick paced in the main room in a manner that Cora, between the difficulties of labor, found both touching and slightly amusing. The baby was a boy. He was red-faced and loud and entirely healthy, and when the doctor placed him in Patrick's arms, Patrick looked down at the child with an expression Cora had never seen on his face before, something that went beyond all the categories she had observed in him. He stood very still with the baby, the way he stood still when something had reached him deeply, and then he looked up at Cora, and she could see that he was at the limit of what he had words for. "Hello," he said to the baby, quietly. His voice was different, softer. "I am your father." Cora had thought she might be too tired to feel the full weight of the moment, but she was wrong about that. They named him William, for Patrick's father. Will, they called him almost immediately. Will Alden grew in the way babies grew, demanding and extraordinary, revealing himself week by week as a specific person rather than simply a general baby. He had Patrick's dark eyes and Cora's particular expression of focused attention, and by the time he was 4 months old, he had demonstrated an opinion about everything and a carrying voice for sharing those opinions. Patrick was a father in the way he was everything, with the attentiveness of a man who does not do things by half. He was up in the night without complaint when Cora was exhausted past the point of functioning. He learned the specific things that soothed Will, which sounds and which movements, and applied this knowledge with the same practical efficiency he applied to everything else. The hands, all 6 of them, were utterly undone by the baby. Ellis Park, who was 21 now and slightly less perpetually hungry, but still the most enthusiastic person in any room, offered to hold Will every morning before breakfast and was visibly delighted when allowed to do so. Tom Bray, who had grandchildren in Kansas he rarely saw, sat with Will on his lap one evening after supper with an expression of such quiet contentment that Cora had to look away to keep her composure. Hector Vasquez sang to the baby in Spanish when he thought no one was listening, and the songs were clearly lullabies, lovely and unhurried. Summer came with its enormous heat and its blue sky, and Will was 6 months old and discovering that the world was a large and interesting place, and Cora went back to her garden with the baby propped in a basket in the shade, and worked the rows of tomatoes and beans, while he watched the leaves move, and communicated his observations with great enthusiasm. One evening in August, sitting on the porch as they still did whenever the evening allowed it, with Will asleep in the cradle inside and the crickets loud in the warm dark, Patrick said, "I want to show you something tomorrow." "What?" "I have been thinking about adding a room to the house," he said, "making it larger. There's a man in town, a builder, who could do it properly." She turned to look at him. "A room. 2, actually," he said. He rubbed the back of his neck. "We may need more than 1 eventually." She looked at him steadily. "If you want," he said, with the care he always used when he was proposing something rather than assuming. "I want," she said. He smiled. The full, unguarded smile that she had first seen on the evening she had told him she liked him very much and had been working hard not to. It still had exactly the same effect on her, which she found both helpless and wonderful. "Good," he said. "I'll speak to the builder." The construction began in September and was completed before the winter cold arrived. The house, which had been a functional and spare cedar building, became something that deserved the word home in a fuller sense, with the new rooms giving them space to live rather than simply exist. Cora arranged the rooms with the care of a woman who has spent enough time without proper belonging to know exactly what it means, and she put her mother's Bible back on the mantel in the center of the house, where it could be seen from every angle of the main room. Alina and James came for Christmas, as they had promised, and Alina held Will with the practiced ease of a woman who had 2 children of her own, the Carmichael children who had not been able to make the journey from Austin but who had sent small gifts wrapped in bright paper that Will regarded with profound suspicion. Alina looked at the expanded house and at her brother's face and at Cora moving through the kitchen with the ease of absolute ownership and said, "You did it." "Did what?" Cora asked. "Made a home," Eleanor said. "A real one. The kind that was here before, I suppose, sort of, but not like this. This is something entirely yours." Cora thought of July of 1878. The worn Bible against her chest, the dust on her boots, the way the town had looked when she stepped off the stage, small and strange and belonging to no one she knew. She thought of her mother's garden and her mother's handwriting and the faith that had been written into the margins of her life by someone who loved her and knew what it was worth. "Not entirely mine," she said, "but mine and Patrick's, which is the same thing." The new year came, 1881, and with it a spring that was particularly generous, the grass very green and the wildflowers erupting across the pastures in the late March warmth. Will was a year old and attempting to walk with the determination of someone who has decided that crawling is beneath their dignity, and Patrick followed him around the yard, catching him when he fell without making too great a production of it, which Will appreciated. That spring Cora also became aware that the school in Harlan's Crossing was again without a teacher, the second absence in 3 years, and she went to speak to Reverend Aldridge about it because the education of children in the town was something she had been thinking about since she arrived and never quite had the right moment to act on. Reverend Aldridge listened to her with great attention. "Could you teach?" he asked. She had taught herself to read from her mother's Bible before she started school. She had helped her mother tutor the neighbors' children in St. Louis. She had been the one who reviewed Ellis Park's letters to his family in Ohio and helped him with spelling and grammar, which Ellis had accepted with great goodwill. "Yes," she said, 3 days a week if the ranch can manage without me in the mornings. I would need to bring Will with me until he is older." Patrick, when she told him, was immediately in agreement. "I can manage breakfast 3 days a week," he said. "The men will survive my cooking." "They will not enjoy it," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it will be worth it." She began teaching that April, 23 students in the white-painted schoolhouse that the community had built a decade earlier and never quite managed to keep a permanent teacher in. She was 27 years old and stood in front of those 23 children with Will on her hip for the first quarter of the school day before he fell asleep, and she could put him in the basket under her desk. And she taught them reading and arithmetic and the basic history that she knew. And she was good at it in the way that people who love learning are always good at sharing it. Martha Greer told her afterward, that first week, that 3 different families had stopped in the store to say how pleased they were to have a teacher who clearly cared about the work. Cora was more moved by this than she showed. The school year extended from April to late November, and she taught through it with the seasons changing around her, and Will growing steadily, and the class of 23 becoming 25 as 2 new families arrived in the territory and sent their children to her. She kept her own record of each child's progress in a ledger she bought from Martha's store, and she wrote notes in the margins of it the way her mother had written notes in the margins of her Bible, observations about the specific qualities of specific minds. Patrick came to pick her up from school on the afternoons when she walked back, and this became a thing the children anticipated. The tall rancher with the quiet manner who arrived in the yard and waited without impatience for their teacher to finish saying goodbye to the last child, who was almost always Ellis Park's younger brother, a boy of 8 named James Park who had more questions than any child she had ever met, and had apparently inherited the family characteristic of being perpetually interested. She climbed up beside Patrick on the wagon seat one November afternoon with the last autumn light burning gold across the grass and James Park's final question of the day still in her mind, which had been about why the stars moved, and Will asleep against her shoulder, and Patrick said, "Good day." "Very good," she said. "James Park wants to know why the stars move." "What did you tell him?" "The truth, which is that they don't, we do. The earth turns." She shifted Will to a more comfortable position. He accepted this with great seriousness, and then immediately asked why the earth turns, so the next lesson is mapped out. Patrick made the sound that was his laugh when he kept it quiet for the sleeping child's sake. He put his arm around her, the familiar, easy warmth of it, and she leaned against his shoulder as the wagon rolled along the trail toward home in the failing light. "I have been thinking," he said after a moment. "You are always thinking," she said. "I think more than I used to," he said. "Since you started reading to me." She looked up at him. "Is that true? Things get in," he said simply. "Things you read. They stay around." She was quiet for a moment. "My mother would have liked you," she said. "I would have liked to know her," he said. The winter of 1881 was cold but manageable, and by spring Cora was certain enough to tell Patrick that they were expecting again, and his response this time was the same as the first, his hands covering hers and his expression going to that place beyond categories, only faster, with the ease of a man who has already learned what he feels about this. The second baby came in October of 1882. A girl this time, healthy and dark-eyed, and arrived with a decisive quality about her that made Dr. Hensley laugh. They named her Ruth, for the character in Cora's Bible who had gone into an unfamiliar land and made it her own, which seemed to Cora the right kind of name for a daughter of hers. Will, who was 2 and 3 months and had strong opinions about every aspect of his world, regarded his sister with the complex mixture of fascination and proprietary concern that firstborns often produce, and by the end of the first week, he had appointed himself her chief observer and alarm raiser, a position he took with complete seriousness. Life on the Alden Ranch in 1882 had a fullness to it that Cora could not have imagined in July of 1878, not because she had been incapable of imagining it, but because she had not dared. The kitchen was still the center of the house, smelling of bread and coffee and whatever was on the stove, and the mantel held her mother's Bible and 2 small carved animals that Patrick had made for Will, and the pressed flour that Ruth had received at her birth from a leaner, who had sent it by mail with a letter full of delight. The yard had the kitchen garden and the chickens that Cora had acquired in her first year and never gotten rid of because they were useful and also, she privately admitted, entertaining. The bunkhouse still held Tom Bray and Hector Vasquez and Lou Fenwick and Big Charlie Dodd and Samuel Reed, though Ellis Park had left in the spring of 1882 to try his hand at starting his own operation on a small piece of land he'd saved for, and had come back twice to visit with the shy pride of a young man who is doing exactly what he hoped to do. The hands, the ones who remained, had become in the way of people who share a small world, something adjacent to family. Tom Bray had told Cora once, with the brevity of a man who does not make speeches, "You are good for all of this." She had thanked him and said she hoped so. He had nodded and gone back to his coffee, satisfied. In the spring of 1883, Patrick came home from town with a letter from a leaner containing the news that she and James would be moving to Dallas, which was closer to Harlan's Crossing than Austin had been, and which meant that visits would become more frequent. The news clearly pleased him, and Cora watched him reading the letter at the kitchen table and thought about how much of his pleasure in it had to do with the family that now surrounded the ranch, the letters and the visits and the knowledge of people who cared, and how he had lived before without those things, and how she understood now, from his ease, how much he had needed them. She was 30 years old in 1883, and she taught school 3 days a week and ran the ranch kitchen and raised 2 children and sat on the porch in the evenings with her husband and read aloud by the fire at night. And on Sunday mornings, they drove to Harlan's Crossing and sat in the second pew and held the hymnals open. And she sang, and he followed the words with his eyes. And Reverend Aldridge preached with the enthusiasm of a man who considers his work a genuine privilege. One Sunday evening in May, she was sitting in the main room with the children both asleep, while having gone down with the sudden total abandonment of energy that toddlers produce, Ruth in her cradle, making the small sound she made in sleep that Cora would have been able to identify across a crowded room. The house was quiet in the particular quality that houses achieve when children are asleep in them, a charged quiet, full of presence. Patrick came in from checking the animals and sat down across from her, and she looked up from the Bible in her lap. "I have been meaning to tell you something," he said. She set the Bible down on the arm of the chair. He was looking at her with that direct, earnest quality that she had loved from the beginning. "When you came here," he said, "I wasn't exactly sure what I was hoping for. I needed a cook. I said that to myself. That was the practical thing, the thing I was allowed to need." He paused. "I didn't know I was lonely. I had been it so long that I had stopped recognizing it." She said nothing, because this was one of the moments when he needed space to arrive at what he was saying. "You read your mother's Bible on my kitchen table," he said, "and I sat down across from you and I thought, this person has something I don't have. Not the faith exactly, though that's part of it. Something else. A sense of what's worth carrying." He looked at the Bible on her chair arm. "You have carried that your whole life, even when you had nothing else." She thought of July, the stage, the dust, the weight of the worn leather cover against her chest as she walked into Martha Greer's store. "I never felt like it was nothing else," she said. "It was always enough." "I know," he said. "That's what I'm trying to say." She reached across the space between them and took his hand. "You have given me more than enough," she said. "You have given me everything." He turned her hand over in his and held it the way he always had, with a simple completeness, and the fire crackled and the house held the sleeping children, and outside the Texas night was enormous and full of stars. "We've made something good here," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "We have." She reached for the Bible with her other hand and opened it to the most worn page, the page with her mother's handwriting cramped in the margins, and she read it aloud in the firelight. Not any particular passage, but everything on the page. Her mother's words and the scripture and the marginalia together. Her mother's voice and God's voice braided together the way they had always been in her mind. And Patrick sat across from her and listened with the full attention of a man who has learned that these things get in and stay around and matter. The summer of 1883 unfolded in its heat and its plenty, the garden producing better than any previous year, the herd in good condition. The school closed for summer, but the 25 children of Harlan's crossing in her thoughts as she planned the coming year's curriculum with the same care she gave to the kitchen garden. She had put a note in the margin of her teaching ledger that September, something one of the older students, a girl of 12 named Maggie Dowd, had said about a poem they had read, which was that it made her feel like someone understood something she had always felt but couldn't say. Cora had written this down and looked at it sometimes when the work of teaching felt routine, to remember what it was actually for. In October of 1883, Alina and James came from Dallas for a visit, their first from the new location, and the proximity of it was immediately apparent in the relaxed confidence with which they arrived, knowing the journey was manageable and could be repeated. Alina's children had come this time, a boy of 10 named Robert who regarded the Alden Ranch with the open curiosity of a city child encountering genuine cattle country, and a girl of 8 named Clara who attached herself to Cora with immediate affection and followed her around the kitchen asking detailed questions about every process. Will, at 3, greeted his cousins with the proprietorial pride of a child showing off his territory, leading Robert around the yard and the barn with the authority of someone who has lived in a place long enough to know it fully. Robert, to his credit, was genuinely interested rather than superior, and by the end of the first day they were deep in a friendship that had no history but felt immediately real. Clara helped Cora make biscuits, and when they came out of the oven, Clara looked at them with an expression of such pure triumph that everyone at the table applauded, which made Clara laugh with a delight that filled the room. That evening the whole family sat around the expanded table, which required 2 extra chairs brought in from the porch, and the noise and warmth of it, 8 people in conversation with the fire going and the wind outside and the children's voices woven through the adult conversation, was something Cora sat in the middle of and felt with every part of herself. She looked down the table at Patrick, who was listening to James tell a story about a courthouse in Dallas with the patient attention he gave everything. And he caught her looking, and something passed between them across the table, an acknowledgement of this moment and its fullness, brief and complete. She thought of her mother, as she often did in the moments that deserved witness. She thought of the Bible on the mantel. She thought of the margins full of faithful handwriting, and the faith that those words represented, not the easy faith that asks for smooth roads, but the harder kind that holds on when the road disappears and trusts that it will reform under your feet. Her mother had been right about that. After the children were in bed and Alina and James had retired, she and Patrick sat on the porch one last time before the November cold made it impractical for the season, wrapped in their coats, the familiar darkness and the familiar stars. "Full house," he said. "I love it," she said. He smiled. "I know. So do I." He was quiet for a moment. "I never thought I would. It would have seemed impractical when I was younger, noise and disorder. And now it seems like the exact right kind of noise," he said. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the dark, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, the horses, the wind in the mesquite, the distant call of something in the dark. The stars were enormous and very clear, the kind of clarity that the winter air in Texas produced, everything sharp and present. She thought of the stagecoach arriving in July of 1878, and the woman she had been on it, 24 and alone, and carrying everything she had in one bag, and in the worn Bible pressed against her heart. She thought of stepping down into the dust of Harlan's Crossing with the sky enormous above her, and the town strange and her position already dissolved, and standing with her shoulders squared the way her mother had taught her, and walking into the general store to ask for help. She thought of riding out to the Alden ranch on a borrowed mare, uncertain and practical and determined, and the tall man who had come out of the barn and looked at her with those dark eyes and said, simply, "You found him." She had found him. She had found all of this. The Bible on the mantel with the firelight catching the worn cover, the children sleeping in the new rooms, the garden waiting for spring, the school waiting for September, the hands in the bunkhouse, the friends in town, the sister in Dallas. The enormous Texas sky. None of it had been promised. All of it had been built from what she brought with her, which was exactly what Patrick had said. Enough. It had always been enough. "Come inside," he said eventually. "It's getting cold." She stood and he stood beside her, and he held the door open the way he always did, and she went inside into the warmth, past the mantel with her mother's Bible on it, into the house that was theirs in every way that mattered. She picked up the Bible from the mantel as she passed it, not for any particular reason, but because it was hers and it was familiar, and the worn weight of it in her hands was the most constant thing in her life, the thing that had been present in every version of it, the difficult ones and the good ones and the ones that were both at once. Patrick watched her settle in her chair by the fire with it. "Read something," he said. She opened it to the most worn page and began to read her mother's words aloud in the firelight, and he settled across from her and listened, the way he had listened every evening since she began, with the full, unhurried attention of a man who has learned that some things are worth stopping for, and that the things that get in and stay around are the ones that matter, and that sometimes a woman arrives with nothing but a worn Bible, and that is, in every way that is real and lasting, more than enough. The fire burned steadily in the hearth. Ruth made a small sound in her sleep. Will turned over in his bed without waking. The wind moved through the mesquite trees outside, and the stars burned large and clear above the Texas plain. Cora Shepard Alden read her mother's words in the margins of the most worn page of the most worn Bible, and Patrick Alden listened, and the house held them all, and it was good, and it was whole, and nothing essential was missing anymore.